Hello, my name is Kelly Reimer. I'm the group leader for the Air Toxics Assessment Group here at the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Today I'll be talking to you about the air toxics risk assessment process. Essentially, I will be giving you an overview of the big picture of the risk assessment process, and I'll also be defining the four main components of the risk assessment process. So let's get started. So you're familiar with this visual. Basically, it represents what happens in the real world when pollution is emitted into the air. Pollution is emitted into the air, it moves across the environment, we come in contact with it, and based on that contact, there's a potential for an adverse health outcome. So what we're going to do here is we're going to move from this visual representation of what really happens in the world when air pollution is emitted into the air to a diagram that describes a risk assessment that will follow, sort of like a map, to complete the risk assessment. Before we do that, I want to go back to the general four-step risk assessment process. You've seen this before in another slide as well. Notice now that we've got the words planning and scoping on the left side of the circle that describes risk assessment. That's the first step in risk assessment. It's very important to plan so that you make sure that you do the right risk assessment and can answer the correct question. So in planning and scoping, we make the following decisions. We remind ourselves first why we're doing the risk assessment, and then we decide what we're including in the risk assessment, what we're not including in the risk assessment, who's going to do which part of the work, how we're going to document it, and how we're going to provide for quality assurance all the way through the process so that the risk assessment is scientifically sound. There are a few essential components in a risk assessment. We do an exposure assessment, we do a toxicity assessment, and then we combine information from both of those assessments into the risk characterization. So let's go into more detail about how to do the risk assessment. We start with planning and scoping, and it's important to revisit the planning and scoping document throughout the risk assessment to make sure that we're staying on course. We have our exposure assessment, we have our toxicity assessment, and then we've got the risk characterization. Now, when we do each individual parts of these assessments, we answer certain questions. For example, when we do an exposure assessment, the first thing that we ask is who's exposed? What chemicals are they exposed to? And how does that exposure occur? Most cases, in our program anyway, we are looking at the air pathway. In toxicity assessment, the first question we ask is the chemical toxic? Can benzene cause an adverse effect, for example? Once we've established that it can be toxic, then we say, well, what's the relationship between how much that I'm exposed to and the degree of the response? In other words, how toxic is it? We put both of those exposure assessment together with the toxicity assessment, and we answer the following questions in the risk characterization. What's the likelihood that a particular exposure will result in an adverse health effect? We also want to talk about how sure we are of the answer. And that's a normal part of a risk assessment. Every risk assessment has uncertainty in it. And it's important to document that uncertainty in the risk characterization so that the risk manager has a full picture of what we really know and what we really don't know about any particular exposure. So let's make this a little more like a risk assessor would look at it. So we're going to introduce a little bit of language for you. So when we do a risk assessment, we start with our exposure assessment usually, and we characterize the sources. We call that source identification. We also establish how the chemical is released. Then we establish how does the chemical move through the environment, usually in the air, and most of the time, at least in our program, we do that via models. This gives us a chemical concentration in whatever media that we are looking at. Again, I just use the example of air. So then we also want to know a little bit about the population who lives around that facility or those facilities. How many people are there? We also might have different kinds of information about that population, and we would include that in the risk assessment. When you combine this information together, we get what we call our measure of exposure, and that's usually a concentration that the public is exposed to. Then we move to the toxicity assessment. And the first thing we do is we conduct an assessment called a hazard identification. This answers the question, is the chemical toxic? Once we have that answer, then we conduct our dose response assessment. And this quantitates the amount of the toxicant that gives a certain response. It says, how potent is this chemical? Then in the risk characterization, we combine the information from the exposure assessment and from the dose response assessment, and we end up with a quantitative expression of risk, a qualitative expression of risk, which is really a description of the expression of risk. And then we also, again, as I mentioned before, we want to make sure that we describe the uncertainty so that we give the risk manager a full picture, as I said before, of what we know and what we don't know. So we can boil this 4-step process down to a very simple mathematical formula, what we sometimes call just the essence of the risk assessment. And that is that risk is a function of the measure of exposure and the measure of toxicity. So we can simplify it pretty easily. So I've given you a quick overview of the main parts of risk assessment, and that results in our risk characterization. So the obvious question is then, well, what happens next? And what happens next is it's time to make the risk management decision. And as you can see here, there are several other factors and considerations that are on the table and need to be evaluated before the risk management decision is made. And that's including the risk characterization. So let's walk through a couple of the others. For example, there are statutory and legal considerations many times in doing a risk assessment. Here in the Air Office, we do risk assessments under the Clean Air Act. There are also public health considerations. This might be, what other pollutants are people exposed to? Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of really good data about this, but where we have data, we tend to want to present that to the risk manager so they have some information about the context within which we're doing this risk characterization. Also, of course, on the table is risk management options. What are the options to reduce the emissions, therefore reducing the risks? Economic factors, how much do those options cost? And then, of course, with every decision, there are political considerations. So you can see that there's a lot of information that goes into making the risk management decision in addition to the risk characterization. And I want to make an important point here on that. And that is the risk manager really needs to be in the discussion on the planning and scoping way at the beginning of the risk assessment, because the risk manager will help make sure that the risk assessment can answer the questions that need to be answered so that risk management decision can be made. Well, that's it for the overview of the risk assessment process. You're now ready to get into the meat of how to conduct a risk assessment. Thanks.